Zerubbabel, Shealtiel, what wonderful names. Well done. You did much better than I did at my first go at doing them. I was shocking. I got tongue-tied, and I was so nervous because it was my first sermon, and I just couldn't get the words out properly. But you did such a great job. Thank you very much. I want to talk a little bit about that passage to start off with, because it's really, I think, applicable to nowadays, that old story. This is a story about a remnant of people that had been taken into exile and were coming back to their homeland. They had been let go to come back, and they were tasked with building the temple. Now, Solomon's temple was one of the great architectural buildings of the ancient world. It was a fantastic building. People come from afar to see this wonderful place of worship that was created. And I wonder how those remnant must have felt as they came back and saw a temple that had been absolutely decimated and ruined. And they were tasked with a almost impossible job of creating this temple once again, making the building once again the place of the inhabitants of the God's Spirit as the Jewish people of that time understood it. It's a bit like being in the church today when we can look back with nostalgia. And I always like nostalgia because I always say it. I'll say a couple of things that I always say today, but I always say nostalgia isn't what it used to be, is it? They look back and how magnificent it all was. And I think we in church could be a bit in danger of that. And I'm in my 60s now, so I look back and think back to when I came into the church. And the church that I see certainly isn't the church of back then. It was an exciting time when I first came into the church. It was a time with something called the Jesus Revolution. And young people were coming to church once again. You know, after the 60s, when people started to abandon church, people started to come back to church. And I'm sure in churches throughout this land, throughout America, there are people who found their faith in that time of the Jesus Revolution who are still in church and leading churches. For some of you, your memories go back much longer than that. And I've heard tales of Sunday schools of 300 and 400 kids. Yeah? Is that true? And churches where it was hard to get a seat. Goodness, there wouldn't be many of those in the Uniting Church in Port Phillip Presbytery East at the moment. You know, there's an abundance of seats. And it may feel a little bit like poor old Haggai and Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, must have felt back then when we've got to go back to try to make some form of glory, to build something that was going to be something that people would behold. We, today's church, face an uphill battle. We've got to change the hearts and minds of people. But the story of Haggai was one of saying that no matter what happens, God is with us. It's about God and not about us as individuals. It's actually God that does the building of faith within people, not us. We get pretty downcast if it's all about us, wouldn't we? You know, I'm sure I know us ministers is not as good as the previous batch of ministers. John, you know, we're not as good as you, and we can't make the congregations grow in the way that perhaps previous ministers do. And perhaps we've lost our way a little bit, I might even suggest, as church. You know, Martin Luther King once said, you know, if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for everything. If you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for everything. And sometimes I wonder what we stand for as church. You know, we're so afraid of our message of love and compassion and justice and mercy and God's grace to humanity that we are frightened to tell that story sometimes. And yet, it is a great story. Then we come to our New Testament story today. The story of Sadducees. And here comes my second one. The Sadducees, as it says in the beginning, didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see. I love it. A great bad pun to start off being back at congregations. The Sadducees, isn't it interesting that as the conversation starts, it says they didn't believe in the resurrection, but what do they want to argue with Jesus about? What happens when someone dies? Are they married to X, Y, or Z? In other words, they were certainly trying to trap Jesus by using something that they thought they would get him one way or another. Yet Jesus talks about this marvellous thing called resurrection. Not the resurrection as we celebrate in Easter, but resurrections. The resurrections that are possible for all humanity. Resurrections that are possible for us. And I want to say here today, in Springvale at 11:15, I believe in resurrections. I believe in a God who has the potential to bring us back and resurrect us to new life. I had a really good conversation while I was on holiday with a friend of mine who is totally, as he says, atheist. Although I love atheists because every time you tell them you're a minister, they want to argue the fact about God. And I say, well, you don't believe in this. Why do you want to argue with me? I want to live my life peacefully. Off you go. But no, they want to argue religion. You ever find people like that? I don't know. You know, they don't know, they don't care about religion, but you talk to them and you tell them you're religious. They certainly want to have something to say about your religion and about the God that you follow. And it's usually not very complimentary, I must add. But it's a great opportunity in some respects. And so, this friend, we had this debate between resurrection and resuscitation. Now, maybe you can give me some sort of clues on the difference between resurrection and resuscitation. I guess resurrection is a bit more like something has died and come back to life. Resuscitation is not quite died. It's not quite fallen away. Which calls me to ask, does the church need resuscitation or resurrection? I'm not talking about us as a congregation, although we need some resuscitation. I think we need both. May I be daring enough to say that there's a heck of a lot of churches that I've seen in recent times, and I have had 5 weeks to look at some other churches that say there are some churches that need resurrections because they're dead and they don't know it. That's a harsh thing to say, isn't it? But it's true. They're just going through the formality of worship. There's not a living being about them. But yet there are places, there is some life and it needs to be resuscitated. So can I be bold enough to suggest we need to actually look at both? We need to look at resuscitation and resurrections. Because as I read Robert's words that I talked about earlier from Newsbeat, it is clear that things are a bit awry here in the southeast, in the Presbytery of Port Phillip East. But it's a continuing story right around Australia, in England, and even in America, that heartland of some kind of Christianity. They are struggling to keep their numbers, to continue their ministries. And there's nothing worse than continuing a ministry just for the sake of continuing it, is there? Really. It's just going through the motions. Because we are a people that are about giving life and talking about life in its abundance. And I have to be honest, there's some churches that you go into and there's no life. And I've got to try and be honest in my preaching about that. It's not necessarily for me to judge whether a church has got life or not life, but the reality is you know that what you see, don't you? You go in and when something feels dead, you can feel it. There is an air of death about some places. Or other places that they're like Doctor Who. Anyone here a Doctor Who fan? Yeah, good on you. I like it. The man in the little police box. If only the world was more like the TARDIS. You could go in, this wonderful thing would open up beyond imagination. But there are churches that are like Doctor Who. They live in a past time You know, you can go in and they don't believe in daylight saving. This is where I've been up to Queensland. You know why they don't believe in daylight saving in Queensland? It upsets the cows and it fades the curtains. But there are churches that are even worse than that, because there are churches that I've been into of recent, not necessarily in this presbytery, but it's as if, you know, daylight savings is not a concept to them because they've turned their clocks back 25 years and they're trying to live 25 years ago rather than for today, with today's issues and today's problems. Because I personally believe that people are searching for some meaning in life. We live in a world that doesn't offer much meaning outside of consumerism and consumption. Take what you can, get what you can. And often those strange conversations that I have with people who profess no faith turn into incredible conversations of yearning and passion to have something more than what they have in their life. People still have their problems. People still have their difficulties. And especially in this world where life seems so fast. My grandfather many years ago, the day before he died, said, the world is just moving too fast for me. I was born into a world that had a horse and cart, and now man is flying to the moon, driving jets around and flying jets around. He said the world simply is moving too fast. And that was so sad because, as I say, the day following that, he passed away. He just came in from an afternoon in the garden and said, I'm going to have a lie down, and that was the end for him. And I think for some of us in the church, we could reiterate that saying, the world is just moving too fast for us. We want to keep it back where it was. We want our sons and daughters to still be in church and our children around us, don't we? I mean, I want that, but the reality is it's not there, is it? Not for us and not for many other churches. So, we've got some problems. We can either be like that little bunch who were wandering around, who were told that they have to rebuild the temple, and that was their job, and we can get pretty disheartened. Because how can we do this? How can we make a difference? How can you and I, with all our years, some of our cynicism, some of our plain wore outness, make a difference to these people? But the answer comes very much in the second story. We follow a God of resurrections. Resurrections for us and for others. Today we preach the good news. The good news amongst difficult situations, amongst sad situations of our own kinds of Sadducees who don't believe in a life beyond what we do, who do not believe in the possibilities that we have in Christ. Where are the Sadducees today? Well, as a Jewish sect, when the temple went, so did they. Because the sad story is that Haggai and his merry bunch did start rebuilding the temple. And the temple became a fine temple, especially under a man called Herod, who we know from a different story. Herod the Great. And the temple was the temple that Jesus himself walked into. But that temple, like the Sadducees, has disappeared. But the story of resurrection and resurrections continues today. Let's be encouraged to be people who are courageous and people of faith in following and believing that God can change us and our world. Amen.